Welcome to the Bicurian podcast, where we explore and embrace the seeming contradictions of life. What actually is Bicurian, you ask?
Well, you may not necessarily have a mental concept of Bicurian, partially maybe because it's a made-up word. You embody it. What's happening right now in terms of the divisions between us is a focus on that which is different.
And lack of understanding and empathy for people's beliefs is no longer an excuse.
And it is in the differences we carry in ourselves that we find the Bicurian moment.
When you really dig into something, you're going to see some depth to it. It's not just a race thing. It's not just a conservation thing.
It's letting go of the or to make room for the and. We embrace all of you. Welcome to the Bicurian.
Welcome to the show. I'm Eric.
And I'm Aisla. And we're going to do a special show today. We have two guests. We're super excited about that.
They're guests we've had before. And somehow we got us all in the same room.
Hey, glad to be here.
Yeah. So I'm not going to say much.
Well, let's do
you
introductions
guys do
first.
most of the talking.
Let's introduce ourselves. So I'm Eric. I do this show.
And
I'm Miguel Baca Barragan with Latin Life Denver, and happy to be back.
I am futurist Chet W. Sisk. My job, of course, is to talk about the next 3 to 5 years, and I'm happy to be back, of course.
So one other thing, because this is radio, not television.
Yes.
I am a white male. Miguel.
Well, Miguel Baca Barragan is known as a Mexican-American, born and raised in Colorado, 16 generations. Actually, excuse me, from the 1600s, I'm actually 14th generation area, 8th generation Coloradoan.
And I am African-American. I'm Chet W. Sisk, African-American. I have been here, actually, my family's been here since 1816. So
in Colorado?
No, in the country. We've been able to trace ourselves back from the first African that was transported over in 1816. His name was John Robinson. He's my ancestor.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, we're able to find ourselves all the way back to him.
And that's so cool.
Yeah, I know.
That's what we did.
Yeah.
So in the true spirit of diversity, we thought this would be a fun idea to get us all together and chat. And I admit that a lot of this is going to be driven by Aisla because she has some questions for us.
And I'm a white female. And very excited to have you guys here. So the topic that I thought might be a great place to start is a little bit of a mouthful, sort of cultural masculinity and how it intersects with mainstream masculinity. How you perceive it, how you experience it, and then sort of another aspect that I would love to hear, so whatever inspires you the most, positive. What is positive masculinity to you?
Yep. I defer to you, my brother.
I'll get you back later.
Get you back later. No deferring.
No deferring here. No. Okay. It's a tough, difficult. Well, excuse me. Obviously that gets me a little tongue-tied. It's weird for me being on this end. You guys are the only ones that ever interviewed me.
Right.
I'm always on your guys' side there, but that's a good way to start for me. It's a difficult question to answer, and this can probably relate to a lot of the Latino experience, especially Mexican-American or Chicano, whatever, generational families that have been here, for example, like mine. I really didn't grow up knowing my dad. He left the family before I was born. They were divorced. He moved back to California, and I was raised pretty much by my grandmother and grandfather, and my mother and my sister. So I always say I was raised by 3 women, because my grandfather was a very, very smart, self-taught man. He left. Education was of the 8th grade, but he had to leave school because he had to work in the fields and support, the family. So he lived in. They migrated to Greeley in order to work the fields. And but he had a scar on half of his face. And so, in other words, life for him growing up was not easy. Not only was he Mexican, as a child spoke only Spanish, but in the community, even in the Mexican community, simple features like that can make others discriminate against, especially children, because they say el diablo, el niño del diablo, a child of the devil. And it's basically like a devil's curse kind of look at a very mean. However, so my grandfather would, share a story with me once when he would go to church or the store. The neighbors would say, "Oh, is that?" He had, I think, 13 or 12 other brothers and sisters, a big family. And so when he would go to church, the folks would ask, "Is that your son? The little one there?" No, that's the neighbor's boy. So even his own family had a difficult time trying to accept that birthmark of his. So that kind of made him very introverted, shallow. Never said "I love you," never told me, gave me a hug. Not until his later years, close to his death. But he was just a very stern man. He knew what was up. He knew what was going on. When I got out of line, he was not shameful or hesitant to give me a licking and straighten me out, and then he would let me go about my way. I mean, I remember some of the things but it wasn't in any like he was trying to get satisfaction out of it. It was really that he was just going to make sure that I didn't treat others the way that I wouldn't want to be treated. So I had come home from school and I had made a negative remark. And boy, he hit me good, quick, knocked me across the kitchen. And I'd never been caught like that before, And I looked up and I said, Abuelito, ¿qué pasó? I mean, what did I do? Yeah. And he goes, you like, and kind of threw me at my own. And people, things that I've experienced in my life. And at that point, at such a young age. And I said, no, sir. I said, I don't. He says, well, what gives you the right? So from that point on, I learned, I looked at him, since I was a child, I looked at him as my male role model. But then as growing up without a father, you have friends and they're all like, hey, where's your, it's dad's day at school, right? And, where's your dad? My dad's dead. I would make up different stories because I didn't have one to come around. I never, no dad to pick me up after baseball or football. My grandfather would, but he didn't interact. So none of the families knew that he was my grandfather. He would just sit in the stands in the back and then he'd wait in the car and yell at me if I didn't run right after practice, So, but he was tough, stern. So it gave me, and also very respectful of women. He had 3 daughters, for all sakes, and each one of them went to college. First time college graduates. Of course, the eldest being Fernie, she was the first college graduate of our direct family, and then my mother, Polly, and then my aunt Betty, all went to college and graduated. So he was very, very pro, female growth and self motivating. As far as he was very supportive in what his girls were going to do. They were going to go to school and get their education, and they were going to achieve whatever they wanted, not rely on any man. In other words, and then my grandmother was always very passive, so she was very sexist, more than my grandfather. I think was. No, my grandmother was a male has their role and a female has her role. So although she didn't interrupt the girls going and getting their college education, but she was very much sexist in that sense. So it was kind of interesting to see that reverse sense, especially of an elder family, because the elder families weren't like that. So that kind of gave a little intro of what had come about. But I believe when you ask about masculinity, it really comes from self. I saw the negative on my father's side. And to this day, and unfortunately, but I mean, I love him. He gave me birth, so I can't deny that. But there's certain things I don't see myself being accepting to do. But my grandfather, incredible. And then my mother, of course, being the ultimate male figure in my life. As soon as I said something wrong, once I said, That must be somebody cut her off, and I was maybe 5, 6 years old. Just came back from California from my dad, visiting a week with my dad, right? So I must have had probably something got slipped in there. And I said, oh, that must be a woman driving. Woo, boy. Woo. Without even slowing down, losing lane, nothing. I felt more than two hands, I tell you that much. And to this day, she still gives me, a heck about it to this day. And I will never forget that. I've never said anything near something like that. But that's where I think, from my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah.
Chet?
Well, I had a wonderful father. He's passed away. And my parents invented something called family council, where we basically kind of got together and all the children had a vote in how we were going to run our families and such. And, we got to vote on chores, allowances, if there was what vacation we would go on, and all this stuff. So all of these things were happening. This is in the late 60s, in the 70s. And it was such a stark experience than what I was seeing with my own community, other African-American households. We grew up in a black neighborhood that, as I got older, I started trying to figure out why my experience was so different than some of my colleagues. And that's when I started digging into the whole aspect of really the African-American experience that for, since 1619, now we're on 400 years now, that the purpose of slavery and Jim Crow and all of those things were, the design of it was to emasculate the males through slave seasoning and all of those things because they posed the biggest threat. Now, of course, if you bake that into a system for hundreds of years, you get this pushback now where you see in African-American culture, where the male does this supersized version of who he is in the world, almost an exaggerated, almost cartoonish kind of concept. You see that, about money, getting women, those kinds of things, because you see this pushback on years and years and centuries of this emasculation. And so now we're paying all of us are paying the price for that kind of madness that goes on for such a long time. But it took me a minute to figure that out. But the only way I could figure it out was from my own experience. I was like, well, my experience is different than what I'm seeing around me. And why is that? And just as a point of reference, of course, I go over all the data. African-American men are more likely to be involved in their children's upbringing than all other cultures combined. And I kept thinking to myself, that's a direct mark against the stereotype. Let me check the numbers.
I was going to say that's not what you hear.
That's not the stereotype, but but what's happened, of course, is that even with all of the African-American men that have been incarcerated or killed and those kinds of things, even the few that exist, or not the few, but there are a number of us that exist, we are more likely to be involved. I didn't think that we would be more even than Latino cultures, but then they started looking at the numbers and say, nope, they spend more time with the children, more time in their development, more time involved just overall. In fact, it was white men that were last on the list. So it is not a matter of, at least in the African-American culture, and because really African-American and Latino cultures were pretty close, but it's the stereotypes that they're not involved is a political stereotype. And it's designed to kind of create the image of the guy. And then, of course, you get that complicated by this super character that I talked about that seeks to kind of cover the waterfront of what emasculation, hundreds of years of emasculation did. So you can't make it up by style and fashion, but if all you've known prior to that is a negative, that you're trying to make it a positive in the most extreme fashion. And so, like I said, my experience because of my dad is just completely different, because he was like, nope, everybody has a voice, everybody's empowered. That's cool. And everybody is going to be responsible too. It was never like you get this and then good luck. It was like, if you're going to get this power, you're going to be responsible for that power as well. And then that basically led to me writing the books that I did about empowerment and even my leaning toward the whole aspect of democracy, what it really meant to empower people and make sure that they're grounded in their power so that they can exercise it, and the responsibility behind that. So
May I put you on the spot?
absolutely.
And ask, so you had that experience as a child,
Yep.
and you're also a father.
Yes.
So did that carry through for you?
Absolutely. I mean, my sons my sons are like in their late 20s and early 30s, two sons. And they always say the same thing. We had the greatest childhood in the world. They
Nice.
do a lot of knucklehead things now.
Congratulations.
But, but I'm like, okay, so reference the early childhood and do some great things in the world. But they always say the same thing because, yes, you're right, that if you get that experience early enough, that was my thought was that I'm going to duplicate, and me and my wife would sit back and we would just kind of break it down and say, what were the things that we did not like in our childhood? What are the things that we do like? How do we emphasize that? So we were conscious parents. And we found each other, which was really an amazing thing, that we were like, oh, we both want this. She's my ex-wife now, but we're still really close, Native American and African American. So we were pulling from our experiences and thinking about the things that we didn't like that we saw, particularly she was thinking about some of the things on the res and how that was affecting, I mean, there is nothing compared to the madness that goes on so many reservations now because of, the levels. Again, I can't emphasize enough. Years and years of oppression do have an effect.
Oh, absolutely.
They have a cultural effect. They have a values effect. They have a spiritual effect. All
They have
of
a
those
psychological
things.
effect.
Psychological effect. All of those things. So we were at least conscious of that and said, let's do our best with our sons to make sure that they don't fall into that gap and empower them the best way that we could. So yes, it did pass forward because my father did.
That's really beautiful.
Yeah, he was a beautiful man. I mean, in the end, I had to take care of him because he was suffering from prostate cancer in the end. And I remember going through this shift in my mind, recognizing how he was always the guy who looked out for me, and now the roles had reversed.
Yeah.
And it's a telling thing to a man when another man has to take care of the man who used to take care of you. It's a hell of a thing. You have to kind of work your head around it, but recognize that that is part of being a man, is making sure that you're present and there for those other people.
Just really quick, because I like what you said there, Chet, as far as the reversal of the roles. I moved back to Colorado from Arizona because my grandparents became down with terminal cancer.
Okay, yeah.
And the last thing, going back to a little bit of the masculinity part of it, as he got to a point where he wasn't able to take care of himself, I got a phone call once, and I was at work, and my grandmother says, well, I don't know what's wrong with your grandfather. He won't come out of the bathroom. And I said, well, well, how long has he been in there? Have you knocked on the door? She got me worried. She says, he's responding, but he won't come out. And I said, well, how long has he been in there? Oh, about a couple hours. And I said, oh my good Lord, you can't, why are you just calling me now? I just hung up the phone. I told my boss, I said, I got to go. Ran out the door, went up north. They lived in Thornton, and I ran into and there she's in there, and I go in and I knock on the door. Grandpa, are you okay? And he says, come in, So I go into the bathroom, and there he is, but he had lost circulation in his legs, so he couldn't stand up.
Yep.
But no one else was allowed to take care of him or see him in any non-masculine form as a provider of the family, besides his son or his, his grandson, which was his only son. So, besides my two cousins, but. So
it's
that
kind
was
of interesting
strong.
how those masculine bonds actually, that's probably a pretty common thread, I would assume, in a lot of those situations, there is a certain amount of that masculine connection.
Definitely.
So,
Yeah, definitely.
And in the Latino culture, we tend to have that tie where, for example, my aunt, my uncle, who she first married, Manny and Fierro, when he started getting sick, and he got to a point, who Alex Rodriguez, who she married, her second husband, he became very close friends with Manny. To her ex, and when he got to his lonely, his time, they'd jump in and he'd help him shower and take care of himself, get clothes, and there was no questions, no anything about it. It's, they both loved the same woman, but that was set aside. Now you take ownership as a man.
It's interesting. Yeah.
So, what about you, Eric? Positive masculinity.
So,
You're not getting off the hook.
There you go. All right, I like this.
My story is, I think, unique to both of yours. So my mom was divorced from my father by the time she was done being pregnant with me. So by the time I was born, they were split.
Okay.
And she did want a positive role model in my life. So by the time I was 2, she was married to a man who had been one of my father's best friends.
Okay.
So my dad was pretty much intolerable growing up, and I was cogent enough to realize that.
Okay.
My stepfather was an alcoholic, but not violent. More of just an antagonist and kind of incapable of being functional. And I don't honestly know what would be worse. I have that experience, and I'm like, I don't know, maybe it would have been better if he hit me. Less damage there. So I was raised by my mother entirely. And by the time I was in my late teens and early 20s, I was being accused regularly of being too sensitive. Because I had very feminine views. Just, it was me and my mom versus the world a lot of the time. And I grew up with very thick, feminist ideals.
Yeah, but you know what? The strangest thing is that I grew up with a very strong father, and I would say that I became a feminist in a classic sense.
Right.
But the whole aspect of feminine principled leadership, the concept, because of a father that I saw respect and cherish his wife.
Right. Yeah. And so in a lot of ways, that's what I didn't see. None of the men that my mom chose were particularly respectful of her. I mean, she divorced my father because he cheated on her while she was pregnant.
Sure.
So just there's an aspect of and so growing up, I already had this kind of lack of respect for my father built in.
Sure.
So and what I did after that, my stepdad was fine for the most part. Taught me to throw a football, kept me engaged in masculine activities and things like that. But just in general, it was an emotional thing. And he certainly wasn't a person I'd wanted to be a role model.
Sure.
So I had a very strong, now that I look back on it, because it was completely subconscious, mentor-seeking behavior. And anytime I met somebody who was male, and none of them tended to be, bad people by any means. In fact, they were all musicians or,
points around the room. There's nothing but electronic equipment
exactly
for making music in here.
So I latched on to those, and for the most part, a lot of them were very happy to kind of, do that. I just, teach me, show me. And beyond that, my experiences of masculinity have been in the corporate world. And so from, a white point of view, climbing the corporate ladder, that's in there. Yep. If you're not an alpha male who wants to climb the corporate ladder and drive a Mercedes and run your own business or, climb out of middle management or whatever. And my problem is that all of my mentors had taught me to actually follow my dreams. I am a work to live person, not a live to work person.
Okay.
And I think this goes for all men in general, but especially in the white male culture of a lot of business and stuff. If you're not a go-getter, then there's a negative aspect to that. So, I've had many jobs where it's I rose to district manager at Guitar Center. And the man that I worked for was very mentoring in my life, and he was a great person, and just I could talk to him, I think he might have been one of the first men that I ever kind of told the story that I just told to everybody here, because he took that kind of an interest in and wanted to get to know me as a person and stuff. And he was my boss, and he was just a really cool, fun guy.
Yeah.
I mean, he was also the guy who brought a backpack full of Guinness on our company hikes.
That's
and
really
said
cool.
that it was our job as a
my
team
kind of
to
boss.
make that backpack lighter. So,
Nice.
that was all positive
building.
experiences. But
Sure.
what I came out of that with was realizing that, my time at jobs has often felt uncomfortable, and I've quit jobs because I didn't necessarily care about running the company. And if you don't have that attitude, it can be negative. So, most of my experiences around masculinity have been of the toxic sort.
Interesting. Let me offer this as a thought. I've traveled to about 30 different countries all around the world. Spent a lot of time in Africa, Namibia, Botswana, South Africa, Morocco, Nigeria, Sudan, but Albania, Malaysia, China, all kinds of places. So here's my observation. I see what I would call male chauvinism all over the place.
Yeah.
It's all around the world. So it is not an exclusive American thing. It's not. Then people shouldn't say, oh, Americans. However, this is what I will say. Toxic masculinity is what happens when you have a country that basically sets the table for the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And then highlights how that level of masculinity is a success model.
Right.
And so all the other countries are watching and say, well, there you go, right there.
Yes.
If I want to be like the United States, if I want to be successful like them, that is the blueprint, is to leverage toxic masculinity in all of its forms, in finances and how you treat women. And then we send it out by way of the media, movies, all of those things.
Yeah, now,
so we're setting the tone for the rest of the world.
Right.
That's what I've noticed.
And there are places in the world where it's even worse. And it's a significant problem.
Yeah.
But I mean, in most Asian cultures,
Brunei, it comes to mind. As a
right?
matter of
But
fact.
like in Asian cultures, I mean, not working, 10 to 15 hours a day, not being successful in business, and I mean, suicide is an acceptable answer
Japan.
Right.
in Japan for not being at that. So, like, America is bad, and it is worse in other places even.
Yes.
And so and I think that's where you're not wrong. Like, toxic masculinity around the world, that we are a role model. We always have been, for better or worse.
For better or worse. So that's why.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, there was that video from on India, and they were talking about. Did you see that? Where they were talking about.
I don't think I have.
It was released very recently, and they were interviewing different men about the assaults and the problem of assault and rape there. And one man said, "Oh, rape can't happen. One hand can't clap."
And that's another aspect. I mean, like it floors me
Yes.
when you actually see some of the cultural differences, because that is kind of India, and it is kind of problematic.
India. It really is. And, but here's what I offer. Before you came, Miguel, we were talking about this whole aspect of the potential of the United States, the potential to be able to model something else.
Right? Wouldn't that be great?
Yes. And I think that, in my personal opinion, I believe that's the reason why we're having the Me Too moment. It has to come to a head, because you can't have that level of toxicity.
It has to be an antidote.
Right.
sort.
And to be the model for the rest of the world, that one model could change the paradigm of of civilizations everywhere, simply because you say the model forward for success is this whole aspect of what I call feminine principle leadership, where you say everybody's involved, everybody's connected, or what we used to talk about in South Africa, what I used to teach at the University of KwaZulu-Natal down in Durban, South Africa. And people used to come up and they say, oh, it's all about Ubuntu. And I was like, oh, what is that? You talk about my mama? What is that? And they say, no. Ubuntu is a philosophical concept that says we all are connected.
Yes.
Everybody matters. It is important that we recognize that everybody matters. Yeah. So you didn't necessarily see that in the city, but when you went to the countryside, particularly with my genetic family that I figured out were Sankoi. And so you saw this equal distribution of power in the communities that I kept going to. I was like, oh, the Sankoi. But so you get that outside of the city, outside of the modern day influence. But Ubuntu it seems to be like the concept that may even save the day, recognizing that everybody matters.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's significant because ultimately, that's where I felt the pressure that I was mentioning, like just not wanting to climb a corporate ladder. I'm a kind of creative artsy type. It's
No, you're kidding.
I
would have never
frowned upon,
guessed.
though. Like, I mean, people appreciate art, and they certainly would
Yes.
hate if their, phone wasn't filled with constant streaming new music and stuff. But I can't even make music or make money as a musician, right? Like that's the world that we kind of live in right now. It's the same kind of a thing, in this rat race and stuff like that. It just pays for people to really stop. Being connected is really to me about appreciation. Whether it's appreciating art, appreciating the person who picks up your trash, these things that we take for granted in each other and in our community, right?
And it's lost. I think a lot of what you were mentioning, Chet, is part of the traditional teachings of the Aztec and the Mayan cultures. They were the woman was really the leader of the. You had your priest, but the entire culture revolved around the woman and their womb, because there wasn't life if it wasn't for women, and so there was many spiritual prayers and things like that that would honor and value women, and to this day in the Latino culture it still does have that existence, and I do kind of want to touch back a little bit what you mentioned about the involvement as far as those that are engaged in their children's lives. You do see a little bit of a distance within the Latino male culture to their sons, and it varies sometimes for some reasons. We can't stereotype because that's what we don't do, right? So, but if we say generally what you could see, if you look at it, 9 out of 10 or whatever, I wouldn't even go that extreme. But what's interesting is for example, you mentioned you touched on the fact of just caring for everything around you. I remember living in a smaller town. I lived in Yuma, Arizona, and I knew my mailman, the milk that got delivered. My wife was really good at this. I was married at the time, and she was awesome. She's the one that I would bow down to, and I worked,
Me too. Yeah.
and I follow your philosophy of work to live, really, because how you can't take anything with you. You may as well enjoy what you got right here on this earth, right? So
I'm not trying to win the game.
I'm with you on that one.
But you're not a man if you don't win.
That's
the
right.
game.
That's the thing.
Exactly. You're not the leader, or you're not the powerful one, but which is nonsense. So, however, it is some of the ways that folks learn out there or try to live. But I really do like that work to live, but because what it comes to is my wife, even though she was a stay-at-home mom, I raised my daughter. And now she's getting a PhD and becoming a pharmaceutical, and so she graduates May 30th. So shout out to her.
Congratulations!
Yes,
Yeah.
and she'll be starting her residency in Phoenix, which was kind of bittersweet. So we were all hoping she would come back home, but however. A lot of the things I ask her, and I'm just like, "Where did you get that?" And she says, "Well, you raised me." But she's my stepdaughter,
Yeah.
So you wonder here, and her biological dad was in her life. Unfortunately, he passed away. God bless his soul. But he tried to be as engaged and involved in her life as much as he could. And towards the end, he really did have more time to spend as he left the Navy and started and moved to Yuma. But my point is my wife was really, really good at Christmas time, Thanksgiving. I would come home and she would say, "I'm going to go and spend this or buy this." And I was like, you do what you do best. And I would even ask her, "Can I go out and get me a new pair of boots, work boots?" She's like, "You're the one working. You don't ask." And I'm like, "Well, you got the finances down. I want to make sure I'm not dipping anywhere." That we need. But we had an understanding like that, and it was beautiful. And so the one thing that I would say that we are losing I think traditionally it seems that, I don't know, maybe it's grown away that we maybe aren't as in touch in smaller communities as we used to be. She knew the mailman, the postman, and the people at work. She would send me with items. Oh, take this to Jensen. Take this to, and I was like, how do you know my friends from work? She'd listen to me talk, and she'd absorb all this, and then she'd make them Christmas gifts and Thanksgiving gifts, and everybody got acknowledgement that we appreciated their being engaged with us throughout the year. And that was the thing that I don't see communities doing as much anymore.
Yeah. I want to go in a real esoteric space.
All right. Yes. Go for it.
All right.
Hopefully we'll understand it.
All right. So I believe this. And it was my ex-wife who brought it really to my attention. She said, if you look at the circumstantial information out there was a feminine aesthetic in the world at one particular time. Something happened where all of a sudden women became second-class citizens.
The 1950s. I'm not kidding.
No, it's earlier than that.
Yeah, but I blame the 1950s for the modern version of that because we saw it on
Okay.
TV.
Yep.
That Ward Cleaver came
it was
home
bad.
and expected to have dinner made.
Yeah.
And even though June was somebody that you could look at and say, she's clearly running this household, and Ward is lucky to have her, but it programmed people.
Yeah,
And a lot of things changed because that 1950s view of marriage right now is prevalent. Like, marriage served a purpose before that, and after that time, as people, started getting jobs and all of that, we started marrying for love. It wasn't these purposes. The traditional gender roles were less necessary.
Yeah.
But I'm telling you, I think that something changed when culturally that got glorified.
See, and that goes back to the media, because you can literally, and I encourage anybody to do this just so you get an understanding of what was the propaganda sent out at that point, at that time. Google the Woman's Handbook. From the 1950s.
Okay, we're going to put a link to that too.
Oh my God, I don't know exactly where it is, but if you Google it, you'll bring it up, and it literally tells a woman what her role is.
Oh my gosh.
To not ask her husband when he comes from home from work how his day went. To leave him because he needs to decompress, from work. Don't bother him with the details. Don't have the kids around when he comes home from work.
No, I read an old sewing machine handbook from the 50s, and actually part of the information around it was, before you start your sewing project, make sure you're properly, you want to make sure that you're fresh and you look good, so that when your husband gets home, he's going to be happy with how you look, that your work hasn't taken you away from that. Make sure you prepare his drink and put it in the fridge so that your diversion isn't going to prevent you from doing your job. Like, there was this was the Singer sewing handbook instructions on how to sew.
Well, and I almost feel like that was like a pendulum swing back from the late 30s and 40s, when women had to go to work during World War II. There was almost this, like, I feel like prior to that, culturally, people were too busy just trying to survive in most cases to really be worried about what the roles really looked like. But we had modern conveniences that came in the 40s and 50s. It got a lot easier. Housework was made easier by your sewing machine and your vacuum cleaner and things that, people had time to start thinking about this, but they started also defining it.
Yeah. Let me even go further on that. So when my wife and I got married back in the day, she was a television superstar. They were moving her up to New York. She's beautiful. She's a beautiful woman. And she's like, I'm next in line to go to New York. And I was like, okay.
You're like, I win.
I was like, yes. But then we were out on a date one night, and she pulled me aside. We were already talking about being married, and she pulled me aside and she says, how would you feel if I just wanted to stay home and raise babies? I said, as long as it's your decision, I will support you 100%, and we will make it work. And she said, I think that's what I want to do. I don't want to go to New York.
Really?
And so the most important thing that I learned from that experience is that true feminine liberation is not trying to be like men. It is being able to decide what they want for their lives without societal pressure, or even pressure from their mate, but to say, we're a team. We work together. And my belief is that that whole aspect of the balance between male and female was lost somewhere. That's why I talk about the feminine aesthetic that valued women at a level that is so different than today. In ancient times, I mean, really, even before the 1950s, ancient times, because if you look at a lot of the literature, it's all about the women, the ancient literature.
Yeah.
Particularly certainly in Mesoamerica, the early days, and that Western and Southern Africa, and even some of the Celtic cultures, you see all of this glorification of women, and because they are the closest thing to God, because they could produce a life from their bodies. And somehow it almost seems as though a bunch of men got together and said, oh, hell no, we can't have this. We got to assert our power. And then all of a sudden women became second-class citizens.
Well, and I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's been one of my fundamental problems with feminism. I don't have a problem with feminism. I have a problem when I talk to feminists and they have these different views, right? And then they're at odds with each other, and then they're just infighting that. And it's the same place with a lot of the masculine talk too, except that, you know, I completely agree with you. Like, I believe true feminist empowerment is the ability to make that decision, and the ability to make that decision with your partner, or, you know, in whatever way you want to have the life that you want. That's empowerment, because it isn't about your ability to go and play in the masculine swimming pool,
right,
and fight your way through corporate America and stuff. And fundamentally, like, I think feminism is getting there, and maybe masculinity will too. But right now, it's not okay. It is not as culturally acceptable, right? If a woman says that, you say, you know, that's powerful, that you want to do that's the life you want. And you can be empowered to do that. But if you're a man and say, you know what, I'd like to stay home and raise the kids, that's still a little, people are like,
Oh, it is, yes.
I don't know. That's not real masculinity, is it?
Was that the 80s when they had Mr. Mom?
Oh,
Was
yeah.
Remember that?
I really, actually,
That was a
Chet,
break.
so want to thank you for sharing that. That was absolutely, as a young woman, that was what turned me off of feminism, was that, you know, I was a very intelligent, driven person.
Right.
And what I wanted was to have children and stay home with them.
Yep.
And I found that if I shared that, I was shamed. I was mocked. I was told, you know, don't you want to do something with your life?
Right.
And I'm
My
like,
God.
I'm like, don't we want smart women raising our children?
Beautiful children,
I mean,
yeah.
isn't that worth effort? And it was really interesting to me, because it took me years to get to a point where I could actually embrace a concept of feminism, because I received it as it was a movement that was about telling me
It was being more masculine.
Yeah, it was about being more masculine, and it was about telling me that if I didn't want to do this thing over here with my life, that it wasn't worth anything.
Right.
And I was just like, how is that any different than being told I have to stay home?
Yes, exactly.
The pushback that my wife got from that, fortunately, because we were partners, I defended her and she defended the position. And then we got to the place where she was like, look, I don't care. As long as my relationship with my husband and my children are fine, I don't care. But of course, and they were like, "You were on your way to New York. You're one of the top,
the next star."
Yeah, the next star. She's like, "But I wanna have kids, and I'm gonna hang out with my husband."
And these days, you'll see that on the news. You know, like I've seen anchors on the news, for example, that they disappear. They're going to go on maternity leave, and then you don't hear from them again. And, you know, people will kind of celebrate that. But again, you know, if you're working at a corporate job, and if a man were to do that, it's never going to be received. So it's coming along. But I think fundamentally the problem with feminism and being masculine these days is that nobody knows exactly what it should look like. We talked about this right before we hit the record button. We can talk for hours right now about toxic masculinity, but what is positive masculinity?
See, and I truly do believe that it is. We are redefining what partnership looks like.
Yeah.
And that's where it gets messy, because we're still holding on to those ancient concepts of masculinity and femininity. And it's yet to be defined again, as I talked about one other time, that we really need visionary leadership that helps to define that. I believe that we're up to the task. I don't know if we've found those kinds of people yet. I believe they're there. But that's the challenge, is that when you have visionary leadership that says, let's talk about partnership in the truest sense of the word, then all of a sudden people say, oh, okay, I never really thought about it that way. And then you start to create, I always say this, everything starts with belief, right?
Right.
Yeah.
When you create the belief and the vision behind it, then the policies, the laws, the moral structures, all of those things stem from the basic foundation of belief and vision.
And I think this Me Too is leading to that. I don't know if anybody has noticed, but there was just recently in Denver a newscast woman that made national because she was doing the news, and you know how they stand in front of the big green, most folks may not know that, but it's
a green screen.
Green screen, and then it reflects, the temperatures and everything else. Well, she was pregnant 9 months, and so there was a lot of hit back on. I want to say it was one of our local stations, and all of these. Folks going out there, well, she shouldn't be on the news, and I don't want to see that baby bump, and so she really got ridiculed, but she took it to some would say like a man, right? Okay, I'm not going to go there, but she really took it tough, and then next thing you know, she was on USA Today, and they interviewed her about it, and so to stem back what you were saying, Chet, is. If we can change the culture, that'll also help to change the media, because there came out so much support for her, and now I believe she now has had her baby, and all over the media now they've taken pictures, and she's done some live streaming, while she's in the hospital giving birth. So this.
Nice.
Glorifying the fact that she still did her job, didn't miss a day at work, which is what my mother did.
Right.
Didn't miss a day at work, and still went through full term, had her baby, and just from the hate or the cynicism of having a woman be in a position like that where it's visible. We're starting to break down.
Let me just add on to that. But the kind of grief, I don't know if you went through this, but the kind of grief that my ex-wife went through when she was just breastfeeding the baby, towel over, the baby would be there. Most of it came from other women.
Yep.
Oh,
yeah.
You had that experience, right, Ys?
Oh yeah. Oh. It's a really interesting. That's one of the things that I find very interesting is when people talk about misogyny, oftentimes there's this assumption that misogyny means that men are bad to women, or it's not. That misogyny is an underlying cultural assumption about men and women that is not necessarily respectful. It doesn't actually reference the gender of the person who's carrying it.
Exactly.
And there are plenty of women who are highly misogynistic, and they express their misogynistic views aggressively, and they then say, but I'm a woman, so therefore I can't be misogynistic.
Yeah.
And you see it all the time, and it's a very distressing experience, because that people buy into that belief that misogyny is. It's not about when we
nobody's coined this phrase, but that sounds to me like toxic feminism, right?
It is toxic feminism.
But
toxic.
It stems from the same source, same source that says we are not even, that we are not all valuable, that men are more valuable. So it doesn't matter what gender holds it, it's the same source. It keeps coming back to the same thing. We had something very similar. Me and another person were talking about this person who got up and testified before Congress recently, and they said, she was a African American female, and the person said, "Oh, I can't believe she says this. Oh, she's a white supremacist." And he said, "How can she be a white supremacist?" I said, "If she espouses the values of white supremacy, she's a white supremacist." So
there you go.
It's not a matter of the gender. It's not a matter of the skin color. If you espouse those particular principles and ideas, you are either a sexist, a misogynist, a white supremacist. It doesn't make any difference.
Yeah. A bigot.
It's the same. It doesn't matter where it's coming from.
Right.
Those are things that people can and do.
Right.
Right.
And we're indoctrinated into some of those concepts over extended periods of time. So it really comes down to our values, because the values will be picked up by the people, and then it will be fostered by the people if you get those values. That's why you see things inside of the African American culture where you see a lot of self-hate, because after the hate indoctrinates itself into the culture over hundreds of years, people say, well, see, he says it, so it must be right. Well,
Right.
it's just shared values.
So that actually really brings me to an observation that I have a little bit more of a specificity around in terms of, you were talking about the oppression and the systemic nature of these things. We've touched on it in a variety of ways. And one of the things that I feel like I noticed about men, so I'm not a man, but I'm in this world, and I raised a son. And when my child was younger, I was in a lesbian relationship. So it was me and my wife and my daughter and my son. So he's alone in our household. And he has some really funny, he has some funny stories he tells about that. But when he was like maybe 6 years old, I had to let him go into the bathroom by himself. And I'm at a public event, and one of my male friends is there, and I said, would you be willing to go in, like, this is a public sporting arena or something. I don't necessarily want him to be totally by himself, but obviously I can't take him into the women's room anymore. Sure. And so my friend says, no problem. And he goes in, and then he comes out and he says, no one's taught your son about urinals? And I'm just like, what is there to teach about that? Like, I don't know what you're talking about. And he said, you can't stand next to somebody and you can't look at them. And it was like, well, that's news to me, right? Like, I've never had that experience at all. But so I just like, okay, right. There's these things that you all know because you just do them that you don't necessarily communicate. Like, if he had been going in to the bathroom with men, that's the first time he ever went into a public bathroom with a man. At some point, he would have looked up at, his dad or, and seen this is how they do, because that's how kids learn. They observe it, right? Yeah. Yep. And then they copy it. But because he didn't have the experience of really copying anyone, he did it very inappropriately, from what I understand. And then my friend corrected him, and he said, there are some other things I'm going to take him to do over time. We're gonna fix this situation. I was like, thanks, son. Yeah, cool. But I feel like that's one of the things that I see men run into a lot is, like, that's a benign situation, right? But then there's ideas about what makes you male, like if you're tender, like, or if you cry, or if you don't want to, like, we absorb. I feel like women do it too, but specifically talking about men, like, you absorb those things. You watch other men or high-profile men, and so you don't even necessarily know that you think it's supposed to be that way. Like, I don't think if I'd asked my friend before that experience how he was supposed to handle the urinal, he would have been able to tell me. But he immediately knew when my son did it wrong.
You go, no,
you know what I'm saying?
He missed something here.
But if I just asked you randomly, when you go into the urinal, how do you handle that? You'd be like, one, that's a weird question, and two, I don't even like it. And I feel like that systemic thing is the result of that copying behavior. But then we're so sure of it, or we reinforce it by, someone steps out of line and they cry in front of you, and you behave in this, like, rejecting way accidentally, right?
Yeah. I think I got lucky with that because, and I would assume, and I'm sure your son will probably run along the same lines without having a male role model, is I would go hang out with my friends, spend the day, go play baseball, football, whatever. And the characteristics that I would see their father or male figures, because they weren't their dads necessarily, but they're male figures, someone in your situation. And this was in suburbs area. But so different ethnicities, I was going to different homes, Vietnamese, Mexican, Black and Anglo. So just variety of different friends that I had. And I would go to their homes and I would see how their male figures, role models would act. And I would steal whatever I liked.
Okay.
What I really appreciated.
Yeah,
I appreciated, and I thought, that's cool. I really like that.
There was almost that mentor-seeking mentality that I've noticed in myself.
Yeah, you just own that characteristic.
Yeah, I think we all do. We all did. It really does help to have male friends, or at least gender-specific friends, so that you, as it's the same thing though. It helps to have male friends that help you to learn how to be a male, but it really helps to have a female friend to learn how to be a male around females.
Yeah,
very good.
And have them, astute enough to recognize that you need, and hopefully that they're not showing you some, really profoundly negative behavior.
Well, that's always the hope, right? Because I mean, we were all impressionable at some point, and probably still are.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and along those lines, that's something that I didn't bring up. But about my experience is because I didn't have a lot of that male interaction in my life, I've always tended to have female friends.
Okay.
And for those to not be sexual relationships is another thing that a lot of people are like, how can you be friends with a girl or a woman and not have that be an aspect of it? And again, like that's a masculine thing that I see from other people. I just never picked it up.
Yeah.
But I can have a conversation with a woman and be friends with them for years, and I have several friends like that. Yeah. And it's not like that, but that's just how I've learned to associate.
Did you have a sister?
I did not. I was an only child on top of it all.
Oh, wow.
So my dad remarried, luckily with the woman he cheated on my mom with. And I had two half brothers. So I had some experience of brothers, on occasional weekends.
Okay.
But realistically, my entire experience was only child.
Wow.
So I didn't even have the learn from somebody in my household that was also learning, or teach them, if they were younger or if they were older, so yeah, my mom was literally my connection to the world.
Okay, got it. I'll say this, that I believe that behavior, male, female behavior, is very nuanced. There are a lot of things that work, some things don't work. We do some crazy stuff because we bring in our own packages, our own programming and such.
Yeah.
But I do believe that toxic masculinity is an item in and of itself because it is perpetuated by a culture. That the culture has to say it is okay to do terrible things, and you will be rewarded for those things. So I think
that's my biggest problem with Trump right now.
Yeah, not held accountable. I like that.
We've just taught people of all generations and ages that it's okay to do the things that we're not even talking about him being accused of doing. Like, there was proof. There was his own words saying he did it.
Definitely.
Right, yeah.
And
Just as
we
a
just
view.
told a whole bunch of people that that's okay, and we wonder why toxic masculinity has suddenly reared its head a little bit.
Exactly. And that is, I think that is the distinct difference. We need to make sure that we drill down on that, because I think that what happens is that people start to say every kind of behavior that's a little awkward or goofy or negative that a man does is toxic masculinity. And I don't believe that's true.
Not at all.
I believe that, again, the cultural prerogatives, the cultural cues that say men are better than women, or it's okay to grab them by their genitals, by the culture, that's toxic masculinity. That leads to a destructive culture. Now, the other stuff, like I had a sister, which is why I was asking you about this. She checked me on a whole bunch of stuff.
Oh, mine
Big
too.
sister.
Big sister.
Yeah, and she was like, I would do something like, I'm going to do it. No, you're not. And she would beat me up in case I did. So there was always these little nuances inside of, our smaller experiences. But if the culture doesn't at least model something more affirmative and empowering and lifting up value for all of us, then the negative stuff that we picked up in our childhood or from the guys around the corner, that becomes all of a sudden valued in the system, and then we live a life that way.
We lose.
Yeah.
That's one thing I remember. My sister, just as I probably was 3-4 years old, barely learned how to talk, and we were at a dance or a political reception, and she goes out to dance. I get up off my seat, ran over to her, pull on her shirt, and I said, "Stop dancing," because I wasn't comfortable having any males around any of my family, female family. My mother, especially my sister, she's 4 years older than me, but she definitely kept me in check when it came to that.
So I have 3 brothers and 1 sister, and so it was 5 of us. But our folks laid down a particular value system that we were going to operate out of. Now, that didn't stop me and my brothers and my sisters from getting into all kind of goofiness. Sure. We did. But we always knew that we were being checked by the core value system that the family unit provided and say, no, this is not acceptable. So we knew we were in trouble. We knew when we were out of pocket. We knew it because we knew the value system.
Right.
When the value system is not specifically defined, then the stuff that we were doing in our adolescence and our youth would have been like, oh, it's okay, I did it back then, it's all good. And so again, the toxicity comes from the culture.
And I think that's where the lack of value, the lack of conscious values. And I think that's like when I'm talking about sort of what those things you absorb as masculinity that aren't necessarily consciously intended. I feel like that systemic stuff, women go through it too, but specifically observing the way that it affects men and the way, because they are frequently encouraged not to be vulnerable, not to express their emotional experience.
When I brought up that, the accusations of being too sensitive, I mean, a lot of those came from women that saw me and it was almost,
really?
they're like, oh, you need to guard your heart, honey. Like
Oh, that sounds like my ex.
you're too sensitive for this world. You're not going to get by in it. And it's like, why? Because I'm exhibiting what you're considering a feminine trait.
Wow.
Yeah. I guess that's a good. My wife was the one that, because I would let sometimes I wouldn't get my all of the items from the something simple. I'm just using this as an example, but this is where it really, she would check me on this. And so if I didn't get exactly all my items at the KFC or something, or fast food, I would say, well, it's no big deal, I didn't get all my change back. Oh, it's no big deal. And she'd go, no, don't just let anybody roll over you, and she would, put me to the punch, and I'd go back, and then I started kind of, because she grew up on the West Side. There was no joking around. West Side, and there was no playing, and that's a survival kind of mode. And
it is.
So it was a very male, what you would consider a male trait, was to sit there and stop the moment, stop what was going on, and say, no, I demand that you do this because me. And I'm very passive, and I would just be like, she probably needs it more than I do, all right, I give it. But that's not acceptable, oh no, you put your foot down.
Well, and it's funny because even that right there had more to do with upbringing than even traditional gender roles, right?
True.
But,
exactly. Yeah, it was upbringing.
But we can't always separate that.
Right.
In our experiences and in the information we're receiving and stuff. And so, I've always taken that me being too sensitive was about my upbringing, not because I lacked masculinity.
Right, no.
Even though, they go hand in hand, but I have that different impression in my head about it.
See, I would say that, we all come into this world with our own specific programming. And where the society fails us is that it doesn't allow for us to be full expressions of whatever that is, because we're supposed to get in line. You might be like, they need it, blah, blah, blah. No, get in line, because the line says this and that. That's a toxic culture that says you can't be the full expression of how you came in, how your programming came in the world.
Yeah.
That's I tend to lean on culture because I more so than I do on our individual behavior, because I've seen every particular expression of how people operate, how men in particular operate, working with the World Assembly of Youth. I've seen every different kind of expression of how men operate and how women do too. But I was working with the men, since we're talking about men now, and I saw that there was not room, and particularly in Malaysia, there was not room for a lot of the expressions that the men came programmed with. So they found, cognitive dissonance and like, I need to just chill, and hey, you can't chill, because the culture won't allow for that. So if we modeled a better kind of culture that stressed partnership and relationship as valuable, as more so valuable than this toxicity that expresses itself on both genders, we'd have, I would see, I would venture to say we'd see a dramatic change in our decision making, in our value system, all kinds of things.
Well, and I'm going to say this because I applaud both of you for you've both done it at various different points and made a statement about not reinforcing the stereotype from your racial and cultural backgrounds and stuff. And I really think that's where we're at with masculinity and femininity. in general is the same approach needs to happen. We need to stop generalizing and saying stereotypes like, black men don't stay in their kids' lives, or the different things you mentioned about the Hispanic and Chicano cultures and stuff. We're in the same boat.
Yep.
Because what we're really debating here is the same kind of stereotyping that you had to actively fight from your cultural backgrounds, right?
Yeah.
To start.
Yeah, right. Which is why I keep saying that we're coming to a head the next 3 to 5 years. I mean, look at and this is not a partisan conversation, but look at the political spectrum of what's happening with the Democrats. You're getting every possible spectrum of humanity, which is really saying, yeah, right? So it's saying all of this stuff has to come to a head because we have to define a new way forward. And I don't mean to be too airy about this, but it is a statement about there has to be a new way forward outside of racism, misogyny, sexism. We
could use a lot less isms.
Yeah, lots of isms. And I again, I said this in the other program that I never doubt our potential to rally. And I think the only way that ever happens is if everything is brought to a crisis.
And it can't all come from one side. I think the every movement or every law that has ever been passed is because it took a multicultural and of a group of rallying and demanding that come forward, because I believe if it is, well, we've seen it like in the church. Women were allowed to be priests, as far as things started, but it wasn't good. And then men were allowed to be married and be priests, but that wasn't good because then they had families. Yeah. So then you have the houses of the priest will go to the family if something happens to the priest.
Oh, right.
So now priests have to be celibate. There's nothing in the Bible about priests being celibate.
No.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's because of the structure,
right,
in order to keep the organization. And I'm not downing, I'm a Catholic myself, but, it's the structure. If you have it set up masculine owned, dominated, without any influence, and you will build a toxic culture.
Absolutely. Yep.
And that's what happens, unfortunately. And where we have to grow out of that is through media. I remember growing up, it was rude to honk if you were going on a date, and you better open that door, right?
That's right.
That's right.
You have to come up to the door, and you better be bearing gifts.
Bearing gifts, knock on the door,
Right.
request to take a girl out, and you better open that door each time.
Absolutely.
But now you got technology, cell phones. Hey, babe, I'm out front,
Texting,
and
yeah.
beep, beep. You unlock the doors. I still tend to, if I'm out on a date, I will open that door because I want to make that clear.
Sure.
But that's my old school.
Sure, right.
But now with technology, you just unlock the doors, and there's no that holding the door anymore. There's and which is, I guess it's okay as long as it's respectful and still has a cultural bonding of respect.
And it's agreed.
And it's agreed upon.
Yeah. If she says, "No, I'd rather open the door myself," then you say, "Then by all means."
Well, I've been insisted before. No, go. Go ahead. Because my hesitation is always, that's just the way I was. I will always hesitate.
Exactly. Yeah.
And no, please, pásale. But times are changing, and I don't fear that, but I can see where it can lead to creative problems. But it is something as a culture that we have to adapt to.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you guys so much. And I feel like, one of the things that we want is a vision. And in different ways, each of you has expressed both things from your past.
I have to say this worked out
the future.
exactly how I hoped it would, because we all had some different perspectives. We all have different cultural, racial places. I'm very happy to have gotten to know you guys way better than I would have even expected. So thank you for sharing all of that.
Well, thank you both.
Thank you.
So on that note, we're going to wrap the show. We're going to skip our Bicurian moment since this one went long. We hope you enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening. Join our mailing list at bit.ly/bycure and get episodes and blogs conveniently emailed directly to you. Learn more about us at bycurian.com/podcast.
And if you like what we are doing, please rate us on your listening platform of choice.
Thank you.